So this is well, it's a blue sky post, but it's something that we talked about in the lab several years ago, actually in 2020, I believe, and it's been a problem in machine learning. It's called the double descent problem, or it's double descent theory. It's basically when your error falls and then it goes up and then it falls again. And so this is generalization error versus training error. So generalization error, it falls, it goes up, and then it falls again. It's kind of like this bimodal distribution of generalization error. The training error, however, is unimodal. So the training error you can minimize for training error, but the generalization error is the thing that's problematic here. And so this is, generated a lot of interest in terms of how to solve this problem or how to characterize this problem even. And this is a post by Carl Bergstrom, who goes through this problem and this new paper that talks about this in terms of evolvability. So this is, in talking about generalization. So this is about generalization error versus training error. So in a model, you train your model, and you try to minimize the error of the training set or the testing set on the training set. And so you can minimize your model, and it's usually asymptotic to 0, and so that's fine. But then generalization is a problem during training error, trying to get your model generalized. And so this is where this double descent problem comes into play. And so they talk about this in terms of evolvability. So there's what I found interesting about this paper was that it talks about evolution and it talks about evolvability. And there are a lot of analogies between evolution and especially simulating evolution and this problem in machine learning, where you have this ability to models to generalize. And so we can look at the paper in a minute, but I wanted to go through this post first. So this is Carl Bergstrom, and he's an evolutionary biologist, and as well as like a person who does computational biology and things like that. So there are a couple of posts. So the first post is a bit of evolutionary biology. I'm really intrigued by a new perspective piece from Steve Frank that explores connections between how natural selection creates systems that generalize, and recent work in machine learning about the surprising capabilities of massively overparameterized systems. So this double descent is a problem where you improve your generalization and then it kind of degrades. But then if you overparameterize your model, generalization falls again. So it's this problem of double descent. In other words, the descent occurs under a classical regime, but then it begins to get worse. But then you can improve it again by overparameterizing your model. And so there is this aspect of sort of the systems nature of this problem. Like, does it generalize? Is that a universal thing in other systems? And in this case, can we observe this in natural selection as well? So this second part here, let's start with the basic machine learning result. When learning about statistics, we all learn about the perils of overfitting. Model a data set with too few parameters, you can't capture the signal, but as the number of parameters approaches the number of data points, you overfit badly. So we generally want to avoid the overparameterized regime, but as you can see, it actually does improve our generalization above and beyond what we can do here with where generalization gets worse as training error falls. So in this region, we might stick with this result where, generalization error drops, but our training error isn't optimal. So we don't want to necessarily go with this region here because we haven't optimized our model for training error, but in a sense, we've kind of optimized it for generalization error, at least to some extent. But then as we keep optimizing our training error, generalization error gets worse. But then when we reach this interpolation threshold where we start to get into an overparameterized regime, we start to get lower generalization error with lower training error, even though our model is over-parameterized. So we do have some problems with going out into that right-hand side of the graph, but that's where we can minimize our generalization error as well. So, and then the question is, why is that? What property of the system is there that leads to that result? In other words, as the number of parameters approaches the number of data points, you perform better on the training data, but tend to perform worse on out-of-sample data. So this is an important point, is that if you over-parameterize your system, you can perform better on the training data. Obviously, you know the training data implicitly at that point, or you're basically biasing your model towards the training data. But then when you introduce new data or out of distribution data, which means things that the model's not seen before, that it wasn't trained on, then it does very poorly. The surprising recent finding is that if you continue to add additional parameters, things get better again. So there's something about the parameters, the number of parameters, outside of the fact that you're overfitting, that is improving the model in terms of generalization. It's kind of a counterintuitive result. The result is that so-called double descent of generalization error, illustrated in Steve's figure below, shows this problem. The first descent, decrease in error in out-of-sample data, occurs as you add parameters to the model fit. Error spikes due to overfitting as you continue, but then the trend reverses. But why? The excess dimensions create large subspaces of equivalent training performance by varying generalization ability. So it creates these large subspaces in these large number of dimensions. So you have, as you add your parameters, you add these dimensions, it creates these subspaces of equivalent training performance where you can basically get this result. Within these subspaces, learning dynamics preferentially reach simple, smooth solutions that capture the general structure of the problem rather than its idiosyncratic details. So it's basically a space where you have this sort of generalized model of the problem instead of like very specific aspects of the problem. Note this is a claim about learning dynamics. While there are many solutions that fit the data well, learning dynamics tend to find ones that are smooth and generalized well. Thus, generalization error drops. I don't have a good understanding of why this works and need to read more. I find this very surprising and cool in its own right, but Steve also aims to connect this theory with the evolution by natural selection, which is the part about evolvability. So we have this machine learning model where we have this over-parameterized regime, and so we might translate that to evolution by thinking about over-parameterization as sort of a rugged landscape or a rugged fitness landscape. And so when we have a rugged fitness landscape, we have to be able to evolve our way out of valleys and get our way across the landscape. So if you're familiar with what rugged fitness landscapes are, it's where fitness varies quite a bit across fitness space. And for a population to move to new solutions, it needs to be able to traverse this fitness space. In a very flat or a very smooth fitness space, it's easy to move, it's easy to hill climb up to these optimal points that improve your fitness. But in a rugged landscape, oftentimes there are local valleys that prevent you from like making that smooth move. And so this is very similar to the over-parameterized regime of a machine learning model, where you have a lot of parameters and you have these subspaces where you can do things like evolve new capabilities that can maybe improve your evolvability, ability to evolve, and thus get you to that point. And maybe, if you transfer that population to a smooth landscape, it evolves to that optimal point faster, or climbs the fitness hill faster. So Steve, the author of the paper, observes that evolved biological systems, particularly more complex ones, are good at generalizing about the world. How did they do this? So I kind of gave away the answer. Organisms are able, often able to function effectively in novel circumstances that their ancestors have never experienced, and this is what we call evolvability. So the idea that you can evolve a solution to a problem that maybe you've never experienced before, but the idea is that you can evolve just in general, just be able to change in a direction that's useful, is something that people, I think, are very interested in evolutionary theory. And the idea of evolvability comes down to this: not that you're evolving specific traits, but that you actually have these genes that allow you to evolve. So the idea is that there are genes that encourage plasticity. So you might have genes for plasticity. That additional plasticity allows you to change the population to discover new solutions and more novel solutions. And when that happens, you can then have members of the population reach some fitness peak and then drag the rest of the population along with it. That's the idea. And so this, they're trying to build this analogy between evolvability and evolution and evolutionary populations and this sort of generalization ability in machine learning models. So organisms are often able to function effectively in novel circumstances. How is this possible if natural selection has not had a chance to learn about these novel environments? And I just gave it away that there are these evolvability genes, or there's this ability to be more plastic and visit more spaces in that fitness space, more locations in that fitness space. So Steve conjectures that there at least part of the answer lies in regulatory complexity. So this means that we can regulate our genes more effectively, and it gives us a better ability to change. So there's this tuning of genes through regulatory action that allow different states of the gene to be uncovered. And so the high dimensionality of the resulting phenotypic circuits, Steve proposes, enables a sort of generalization that we see on the right-hand side of the double descent diagram that we saw. So the ability to have these phenotypic circuits have this high level of dimensionality translates into being able to explore these rugged landscapes and traverse them to get to a fitness peak. The double descent pattern also occurs if you look at over-parameterized system performance with increased training time. Steve suggests that evolutionarily older circuits that have more evolutionary training, so to speak, are likely to generalize better than recently formed ones. So this is where, where you train these circuits, and the circuits basically consist of genes for evolvability, which are in turn genes that regulate other genes. Like, they might be genes that enable plasticity, or genes that enable the unlocking of different functional aspects of a circuit. And so if you have older circuits, that means that they've evolved longer. That means that they've been optimized longer, or that they have more components that allow for more controlled change in a certain direction or another. So this is interesting because, this involves the study of evolvability. It involves thinking about the parameter space of a model, whether it be a gradient descent model or a fitness landscape. And it thinks about, it makes us think about this, or forces us to think about the universality of this sort of behavior. If you can look across machine learning models and evolution, then maybe it applies to even more systems. So this is the paper here, and so this is the paper here. Stephen A. Frank, who's in an ecology and evolutionary biology program at Irvine. This was published in the journal Evolution, and he explores this problem here where he has this double descent graph and then connects it to evolution. It's a very short paper, but basically it talks about how natural selection encodes learned information in the genome, And so unlocking that learned information is important in terms of survival and increasing the ability of a population to reach some adaptive fitness peak. And then making this analogy with double descent in machine learning. And so specifically increasing regulatory complexity as a parameterization associates with increasing evolvability for the discovery of general solutions. This link between genomic complexity and generalization may have been a primary driving force in evolutionary history. So that is the paper. And then this other paper is a U-turn on double descent, rethinking parameter counting and statistical learning. This is associated with this because it talks about double descent more directly as a statistical learning phenomenon, and then thinking about sort of how this phenomena occurs in statistical learning. So in this work, we take a closer look at the evidence surrounding these more classical statistical machine learning methods and challenge the claim that observed cases of double descent truly extend the limits of a traditional U-shaped complexity generalization curve therein. We show that once careful consideration is given to what is being plotted on the x-axis of their double descent plots, it becomes apparent that there are implicitly multiple distinct complexity axes along which the parameter count grows. We demonstrate that the second descent appears exactly and only when and where the transition between these underlying axes occur, and that this location is thus not inherently tied to the interpolation threshold p equals n. And so this points to this idea that, when we think about double descent, are we really thinking about it properly just by looking at this graph? And they kind of spell out what double descent is as a phenomenon, and then, so they say, while most attention has naturally been given to the deep learning setting, double descent is shown to emerge more generally across non-neural models. So known cases include linear regression, trees, and boosting. So in things that aren't neural networks, you see this as well, and then you may see it in evolution. But we have to sort of keep in mind that the double descent model is, you can draw the graph out, but you have to understand where the graph comes from and how it relates to the underlying complexity of the system. So I think that's a nice collection of papers. It kind of lays out that problem, lays out that analogy, and then thinking about like how universal is this, or how do we need to maybe rethink this problem, and how does it all connect?